Look, I need to tell you about the day everything changed in the Galactic Council. My name is Ambassador Krellthanks, and I had the misfortune of being present during what we now call the Great Human Negotiation Crisis. Though between you and me, we should have called it the Great Human Ego Check because that is exactly what it was. The Grand Council chamber on Nexus Station was its usual self that day, pretentious, overly dramatic, and filled with enough hot air to inflate a small moon. The chamber's massive crystalline dome sparkled with the light of 3 nearby suns, casting rainbow shadows across the faces of 247 species representatives. All of them wore their finest ceremonial robes, which meant the chamber looked like someone had exploded a paint factory in zero gravity. I sat in my designated spot, trying not to laugh at Ambassador Blixmar's newest head crest. The Regelian had clearly visited what he thought was a prestigious stylist, but ended up looking like he had stuck his head in a protein synthesizer. But I digress. The human delegation sat directly across from the High Council seats. There were 5 of them, a surprisingly small number given the importance of these negotiations. Madison Chen, their lead negotiator, sat in the center. A woman whose calm demeanor somehow made me more nervous than any threat display I had ever witnessed. To her right, Ambassador Rex Henderson, a male whose gray hair and wrinkled face indicated advanced age by human standards, but whose eyes sparkled with an intelligence that made many council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Nyala Patel and General Zhao Wei flanked the other side, both carrying data pads and wearing expressions that humans call poker faces. Now, I have since learned about poker, and let me tell you, those faces could have won them millions in any casino across the galaxy. High Counselor Vaxatur, in all his 12-tentacled glory, hovered at the center of the chamber. His bioluminescent patches pulsed with what he probably thought was intimidating authority, but honestly made him look like a malfunctioning party decoration. "Honored representatives of Earth," he began, voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only a being who has lived for 900 years can achieve. "We have reviewed your petition for membership status adjustment." I watched Madison Chen's left eyebrow rise approximately 2 millimeters. In my extensive study of human expressions, I had learned this tiny movement often preceded what humans call a royal butt-kicking. But of course our esteemed High Counselor was too busy admiring his own tentacle patterns to notice. "We find your species' development fascinating," Vaxatur continued. "Your progress from primitive tool users to basic spacefaring civilization in mere millennia is quaint. The Council has decided to grant humanity probationary Level 3 observational status, with limited trading rights in non-sensitive technologies." The chamber fell silent, the kind of silence that makes you want to check if your atmospheric processor is still working. I noticed Dr. Patel's hand twitch toward what I later learned was a concealed recording device. General Zhao Wei's face remained perfectly neutral, but something in his posture reminded me of the apex predators from my homeworld just before they strike. Ambassador Henderson leaned over and whispered something in Madison Chen's ear. She nodded once, the movement so slight it was barely perceptible. But that nod sent a shiver down all 4 of my spinal columns. What happened next would be recorded in Council history as the moment when everyone realized we had catastrophically miscalculated. Madison Chen smiled. Not the diplomatic smile we had seen before, but something entirely different. Something that made me want to hide under my ceremonial robes and call for my parental units. In the observation gallery, I noticed the human cultural attaché pulling out what appeared to be a recording device with poorly concealed glee. That should have been our second warning. Humans never record things unless they are about to become, as they say, monumentally interesting. The tension in the chamber built like a power core approaching critical mass. 247 species held their breath, or whatever passed for breathing among their kind. Even the ever-chattering Proxima delegates fell silent, their antennae frozen in anticipation. What nobody knew then, but everyone would soon learn, was that humanity had not come to these negotiations seeking the Council's approval. They had come to teach us a lesson. And class, my friends, was about to begin. Madison Chen stood up slowly, smoothing her dark blue diplomatic uniform with deliberate care. The movement caught everyone's attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so precisely controlled. like watching a precision-guided missile preparing to launch. "High Counselor Vaxatur," she said, her voice carrying that dangerous pleasantness that I would later learn humans call customer service voice. "I want to ensure there has been no translation error. Are you stating that the Council's final offer to humanity is probationary level 3 observational status?" Vaxatur's tentacles rippled with satisfaction. Several Council members nodded sagely, clearly pleased with their own generosity. I noticed Ambassador Henderson typing something into his datapad, while Dr. Patel seemed incredibly focused on adjusting her collar camera. "Indeed, Representative Chen," Vaxatur proclaimed. "Given humanity's relatively brief existence as a spacefaring species, this is an exceptionally generous offer. Why, it took the Proximan Federation 3 centuries to achieve such status." He gestured to the Proximan delegates, who were now trying very hard to look anywhere but at the human delegation. The corner of Madison Chen's mouth twitched upward. "I see. And this status would require us to submit all of our technological advancements for Council approval before implementation?" "Naturally," Councilor Tethra chimed in, her crystalline form gleaming with self-importance. "This is for your own protection. Young species often lack the wisdom to properly manage advanced technologies." General Zhao Wei let out a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh. Dr. Patel's fingers flew across her datapad, and I swear I saw Ambassador Henderson hide a smile behind his hand. "And our mining operations in the Kuiper Belt would need to be supervised by Council observers?" Chen continued, her voice now carrying a note that made my survival instincts scream danger. "Correct," Vaxatur beamed, completely missing the warning signs that were making more experienced diplomats edge toward the chamber's exits. "All resource extraction must be monitored to ensure compliance with Council regulations." Madison Chen picked up her datapad with exquisite precision. "And our current trade agreements with the Centaurian Alliance would need to be renegotiated through Council intermediaries?" I felt my throat sacs constrict. Those trade agreements had revolutionized our economy. Surely the humans wouldn't— "Of course," Vaxatur waved a tentacle dismissively. "All diplomatic and economic relations must be properly managed through appropriate Council channels." Chen looked at each member of her delegation. Each gave her a tiny nod. Then she did something that would give diplomatic training instructors nightmares for generations to come. She smiled broadly. "Thank you for this enlightening session," she said, gathering her materials. "The human delegation hereby formally declines the Council's offer and withdraws from membership negotiations." The chamber erupted in chaos. Vaxatur's bioluminescent patches started flashing like a malfunctioning signal array. You cannot simply withdraw," he sputtered, all pretense of superiority vanishing. "Actually," Ambassador Henderson drawled, standing up and straightening his tie, "we can, and we are. Fascinating thing about non-member species, we don't need Council permission to leave talks." But the trade agreements," Blixmar practically shrieked, his head crest now fully erect in panic. "The technology exchanges, the defense treaties." "All negotiated independently," General Zhao Wei stated calmly, helping Dr. Patel pack up her diplomatic terminal. "And all remaining in effect with individual species, unless, of course, the Council attempts to interfere." The implications hit the chamber like a quantum torpedo. Humanity wasn't just walking away from the Council. They were maintaining their independent agreements with individual species, agreements that had made dozens of worlds prosperous, agreements that, under Council law, would become illegal if those species remained Council members while conducting unauthorized trade with a non-member race. I watched in fascinated horror as Madison Chen led her delegation toward the chamber doors. She paused at the threshold and turned back, that terrifying smile still in place. "We will, of course, maintain our current defense commitments. Earth honors its promises. Should any of our trading partners face pressure to terminate existing agreements, they might find humanity's interpretation of defense commitments surprisingly broad." The doors whispered shut behind them, leaving behind a chamber full of panicking diplomats. Vaxatur's tentacles had tied themselves into knots. The Proximan delegates' antennae were practically vibrating off their heads. and Ambassador Blixmar had fainted dead away, his prestigious head crest now drooping sadly over his face. I sat there, watching the chaos unfold, when a message flashed across my diplomatic terminal. It was from Ambassador Henderson. "Drinks at the Human Embassy in 2 hours? We make excellent martinis." That's when I realized they had planned this entire thing. The careful questions, the recorded responses, the timed withdrawal. Humanity hadn't come here to join the Council. They had come here to break it, and judging by the way Councillor Tethera was now arguing with Vaxatur about the legality of their existing trade agreements, they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. In the observation gallery, the human cultural attaché was still recording, and unless my understanding of human facial expressions was completely wrong, she was trying very hard not to laugh. The emergency session was called exactly 47 minutes after the human delegation's departure. I know because I counted every excruciating second while watching Vaxatur's tentacles slowly unknot themselves. The council chamber, which had previously resembled a dignified gathering of galactic civilization's finest, now looked more like a tax collection office during audit season. "Order! I demand order!" Vaxatur's voice cracked as he tried to hover above the chaos. His bioluminescent patches were now pulsing in patterns that roughly translated to several highly inappropriate words in at least 3 languages. Ambassador Blixmar had recovered from his fainting spell, though his prestigious head crest now hung at an angle that made him look perpetually confused. "We must contact them immediately. My trading consortium has 7 cargo ships en route to their solar system." "Your trading consortium?" Councillor Tethera's crystalline form vibrated with indignation. "The Arcturian Defense Ministry has 3 technology exchange programs with their Weapons Development Division." A chorus of similar outbursts erupted across the chamber. The Proximan delegation was attempting to reach their trade ministry through 5 different communication devices simultaneously. The Syrian representatives were huddled in a corner, their scales changing colors so rapidly they resembled a malfunctioning disco light display. "I have authorized an emergency communication to the Human Embassy," Vaxatur announced, his tentacles now somewhat under control, though still twitching sporadically. The massive communication screen activated, showing only an automated message in plain Galactic Standard. "Thank you for contacting the Human Diplomatic Office. We are currently unavailable due to ongoing policy revisions. For immediate assistance, please contact your local human trade representative. For non-urgent matters, please consult our updated interaction protocols, coming soon to a data terminal near you. Have a pleasant solar rotation." The message was followed by what humans call elevator music, a concept that I'm convinced is actually a subtle form of psychological warfare. "They're ghosting us," whispered a junior aide to the Rigelian delegation. When several nearby representatives turned to her in confusion, she explained, "It's a human term. I studied their social media history. It means they're deliberately ignoring us to cause emotional distress." That revelation caused another wave of panic. The Andromedans, who prided themselves on their psychological warfare capabilities, looked both impressed and terrified. "Perhaps," suggested Councillor Zara Nu, one of our calmer members, "we should consider the broader implications of their withdrawal." She pulled up a holographic display showing trade routes across the galaxy. By maintaining independent agreements while rejecting Council membership, they've essentially created a parallel diplomatic network that bypasses our authority entirely. The display highlighted dozens of trade routes, defense pacts, and cultural exchange programs, all centered around Earth but spreading out like a web across Council space. It was beautiful, terrifying, and absolutely brilliant. "Surely they can't maintain such a complex network without Council infrastructure," Vaxatur said, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. "The administrative demands alone." "High Counselor," I found myself speaking up, "you might want to see this." I forwarded a message I'd just received from my government's economic ministry. The humans had apparently spent the last year developing a standardized trade protocol system that could be implemented independent of Council networks. They'd even given it a name that was simultaneously professional and mocking: BACON, Bilateral Agreement and Commerce Operations Network. "They named their independent trade network after cured meat?" someone asked incredulously. They named their independent trade network after cured meat and had it ready to deploy the moment they walked out that door. I corrected, feeling a mix of horror and admiration. The implications hit the chamber like a rogue asteroid. This hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to our condescension. This had been planned, meticulously planned. While we were busy patting ourselves on various appendages for graciously offering them entry-level status, they had been building a complete parallel system of interstellar relations. Another attempt to contact the human embassy resulted in the same automated message, though this time the elevator music had changed to something even more psychologically distressing, apparently called The Song That Never Ends. "What are our options?" Vaxatur asked, trying to maintain some semblance of authority despite looking like he wanted to tie his tentacles around his neck. "We could try sending a delegation to Earth," suggested one of the younger council members. "All flights to human space just got marked as fully booked for the next 3 standard months," reported a frantic communications officer. "Even the private transport companies are suddenly experiencing technical difficulties with their booking systems." The Syrian ambassador, his scales now settled into a sickly shade of green, raised a trembling hand. "Has anyone else noticed that they haven't actually made any demands? They just left." The chamber fell silent as this observation sank in. In all my years of diplomatic service, I had never seen a species win a negotiation by simply walking away from it. Yet somehow humanity had managed to turn their exit into a power play that had the entire council tied in knots. As if to punctuate this point, my diplomatic terminal pinged with another message from Ambassador Henderson. "Martini offer still stands. We also have excellent whiskey and popcorn. Humans find popcorn essential for watching dramatic events unfold." I looked around the chamber, where Vaxatur was now trying to prevent a fistfight between the Proximan and Andromedan delegations over who had better human trade terms, and realized I might need something stronger than a martini dot. Looking back, we should have seen this coming. Our first contact with humans occurred when one of their deep space probes crashed into a Centaurian survey vessel. Instead of an apologetic message, we received a bill for damaging their probe and a request for its immediate return, citing something called intellectual property rights. The council had laughed then, actually laughed, a species barely out of their gravity well, demanding compensation from an advanced spacefaring civilization? How quaint. We ignored them, of course. 3 days later, every single Centaurian communication satellite experienced a mysterious software update that made them play something called Never Gonna Give You Up on all frequencies. They rickrolled an entire species, Dr. Patel had explained during our first official contact meeting, trying to keep a straight face. It's a traditional human greeting. We later discovered this was not, in fact, a traditional human greeting, but by then it was too late. The term rickrolling had already been added to the official first contact protocols. Then came the trade negotiations. The Council sent its most experienced negotiators, armed with complex economic models and centuries of diplomatic precedent. The humans sent a team led by a woman named Beverly Thompson, who spent the entire first session asking increasingly bizarre questions about Council insurance policies and liability coverage. In retrospect, I told the now panicking council chamber, we should have been suspicious when they insisted on including that clause about maintaining independent trade relationships. But they said it was for cultural preservation, protested Ambassador Blixmar, his head crest now completely deflated. They also said their military fleet was primarily for scientific research, added Councillor Tethra. Remember the demonstration they gave us? How could any of us forget? The humans had invited council observers to what they called a routine training exercise. They proceeded to demonstrate their ship's ability to enter and exit faster than light travel with pinpoint accuracy, essentially turning their entire fleet into projectiles that could appear anywhere, at any time, without warning. But surely that was just a coincidence, squeaked a junior delegate. They couldn't have known we'd be more impressed by tactical flexibility than raw firepower. I pulled up the recording from that day. General Zhao Wei's voice came through clear as crystal. Of course, this is just a basic maneuver. Nothing special. Now, who would like some coffee while we discuss trade routes? The Council had collectively missed how the humans never actually showed us their weapons. They never made threats. They just demonstrated capabilities that could be used for perfectly peaceful purposes, which coincidentally could also be used to bypass every single defense system in Council space. "What about that incident with the Proximan pirates?" someone asked. "Ah, yes, that particular diplomatic blunder. The Council had warned humanity about operating in dangerous sectors, suggesting they needed our protection. 1 week later, a group of Proximan pirates attempted to raid a human transport ship. The incident report was a masterpiece of understatement. Human vessel demonstrated unusual problem-solving methodology. Pirates retrieved from escape pods complained of psychological trauma after being forced to watch all episodes of something called Teletubbies while waiting for Council authorities. No shots fired, no lives lost. Just 17 hardened pirates crying in their holding cells and begging to be arrested by anyone except the humans. They've been playing us since day one, I realized, scrolling through years of diplomatic records with growing amazement. Every concession we thought we gained, every negotiation we thought we won. Surely not the cultural exchange program. Vaxatour's tentacles curled anxiously. The cultural exchange program, the Council's pride and joy. We had magnanimously allowed humans to share their entertainment media across Council space, thinking it would show them how much they needed our guidance. Instead, they had introduced the galaxy to something called binge-watching and viral videos. According to latest reports, a communications officer announced, 60% of Council space is currently addicted to human entertainment platforms. The most popular show is something called reality TV, which everyone agrees is terrible but can't stop watching. The chamber grew quiet as centuries of diplomatic interactions suddenly appeared in a new light. Every seeming submission had been a calculated move. Every apparent concession had strengthened their position. Even their technological development, which we had dismissed as impressively fast but ultimately insignificant, took on new meaning. "Has anyone else noticed," I said slowly, "that every time we underestimated them, they never corrected us? They just smiled, nodded, and kept building their networks?" A message flashed across the central display, the first official communication from Earth since their delegation's departure. It contained only 2 lines. "Thank you for attending our TED Talk on leveraging underestimation in interstellar diplomacy. Presentation slides available upon request." In the ensuing silence, I couldn't help but think about that saying humans have about teaching someone to fish versus giving them fish. Apparently, they had a third option, convincing everyone they barely knew what fish were while secretly building the galaxy's largest independent fishing fleet. The Council's research team delivered their preliminary findings 6 hours after the human delegation's departure. The presentation was given by Dr. Nixiara, a renowned xenopsychologist who looked like she hadn't slept in several planetary rotations. Her normally pristine feathers were ruffled, and she kept sipping something that smelled suspiciously like human coffee. "After analyzing centuries of human historical records," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we have concluded that we are, to use their vernacular, completely screwed." The presentation screen behind her lit up with various human diplomatic incidents throughout history. "Humans," she continued, "have developed an extensive array of negotiation techniques that we initially misclassified as primitive or simplistic. We now understand these are actually complex psychological warfare strategies disguised as social customs." She pulled up a concept they called playing chicken. The chamber watched in horror as she explained a game where 2 humans would drive vehicles directly at each other, waiting to see who would swerve first. The one who didn't swerve won. "But that's insane." Councillor Tethra's crystalline form vibrated with distress. "Who would risk mutual destruction just to prove a point?" "Humans would," Dr. Nixiara replied, taking another long sip of coffee. "And here's the terrifying part. They turned this concept into a diplomatic strategy. They call it brinksmanship." The next slide showed various human negotiation patterns. Notice how they consistently appear to put themselves in seemingly disadvantageous positions, only to reveal that they have already prepared multiple contingency plans. They're not actually risking anything. They're just making us think they are. Ambassador Bliximar raised a trembling hand. Are you suggesting they orchestrated this entire situation, even our patronizing attitude? Oh, it gets better, Dr. Nixara laughed, a sound that carried a hint of hysteria. Look at this human educational concept called reverse psychology. They have literally written academic papers on how to make others do what you want by telling them to do the opposite. The research team's cultural analyst stepped forward, a holographic display of human entertainment media floating around him. We've discovered humans have been broadcasting their negotiation strategies across the galaxy for years. They disguise them as something called action movies. Our preliminary analysis suggests that 90% of Council species have watched and enjoyed these instructional videos without recognizing them as such. But surely their withdrawal from negotiations will damage their economy? Asked a hopeful Vaxatur. Dr. Nixara pulled up another concept. This is something humans call a bear trap. Not the physical device, but the market strategy. They've positioned themselves so that any attempt to pressure them economically will cause more damage to Council economies than to their own. It's like they wrote a tutorial on galactic economic warfare, and we treated it as light reading. The tactical analyst, a former military strategist who now looked like he wanted to resign and become a pastoral farmer, took over. Their entire diplomatic corps appears to be trained in something called bluffing. It's a technique from a game called poker where, actually, nobody tell the Andromedans about poker. They're already too good at psychological warfare. The chamber fell silent as we absorbed these revelations. A junior researcher timidly raised the appendage. Should we be concerned about the fact that their cultural database includes thousands of scenarios about successfully fighting against overwhelming odds? You mean like the situation we've just created by trying to force them into a subordinate position? Dr. Nixara asked with a slightly manic grin. The humans have a phrase for this. They call it pushing someone's buttons. She pulled up one final slide, showing a simple Earth game called chess. This game teaches players to sacrifice pieces strategically to win the larger battle. Humans learn this as children. We've spent the last several centuries thinking we were the players, when in fact, we were the pieces. The research team's concluding recommendation was simultaneously the most professional and terrifying document I've ever read. Based on extensive analysis of human behavioral patterns, psychological warfare capabilities, and strategic planning tendencies, we recommend immediately capitulating to any reasonable demands they make, then asking politely if they would be willing to teach us their negotiation techniques. A message flashed across my terminal. It was from Ambassador Henderson again. Just saw your research team's presentation. Excellent work. Quick correction, though. Poker isn't just a game. It's also how we select our diplomats. Madison Chen once won a planetary system with a pair of twos. The other party is still trying to figure out how. I looked up at the council chamber, where Dr. Nixara was now explaining the human concept of reverse psychology to an increasingly pale Vaxatur. In the background, the cultural analyst was trying to convince several species representatives that something called space wrestling was not, in fact, a documentary about human combat techniques. One final note, Dr. Nixara concluded, downing the last of her coffee. We've discovered humans have a saying, the best revenge is living well. They appear to have modified this concept to, the best negotiation strategy is letting your opponent think they're winning while you build a better alternative. She paused, looking around the chamber. Also, they've apparently been recording this entire crisis for something they call their social media history channel. The working title is, How to Train Your Galactic Council. The sound of several hundred diplomatic representatives face-palming echoed through the chamber. The humans returned exactly 24 hours after their departure. They didn't announce their arrival or request permission to enter. The delegation simply walked into the council chamber during our 4th emergency session, while Vaxatur was in the middle of proposing our 19th desperate solution. Good morning, Ambassador Rex Henderson said cheerfully, as if he hadn't helped orchestrate the biggest diplomatic crisis in council history. Lovely day for negotiations, isn't it? Madison Chen followed, carrying what appeared to be a large container of something called donuts. Dr. Patel had a stack of data pads, and General Zhao Wei wore an expression that suggested he was thoroughly enjoying himself while maintaining perfect military composure. The council chamber, which had descended into chaos approximately 23 times in the past day, fell completely silent. Ambassador Blixmar's head crest, which had partially reinflated during the night, deflated so quickly it made a whistling sound. "Please don't let us interrupt," Henderson said, setting up a small coffee dispenser on their delegation table. "Although I must say your 19th emergency solution seems a bit rushed. Have you considered option 20? I hear it's a classic." Vaxatur's tentacles tied themselves into what I recognized as the knot of absolute confusion. You've been monitoring our emergency sessions?" "Oh no, not at all," Madison Chen replied, arranging the donuts. "We've been having a lovely breakfast meeting with several of your member species' independent trade representatives. They were kind enough to keep us updated. Coffee, anyone?" Several council members tried very hard not to look guilty. They failed spectacularly. "Now then," Henderson continued, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone want to confess their sins. "Shall we discuss the actual negotiations? The real ones this time, not the theatrical performance we've all been participating in." "Real negotiations?" Vaxatur managed to unknot 3 of his tentacles. "But you withdrew." "Did we?" Chen asked, raising that dangerous eyebrow again. "Or did we simply decline a preliminary offer that everyone in this chamber knew was ridiculous? By the way, these donuts are from a delightful bakery on Proxima Centauri 3. Fascinating how well their bakers have adapted Earth recipes." The implications hit everyone at once. While we had been panicking about losing access to human trade, they had been calmly expanding it. The Proximan delegates looked extremely interested in their data terminals. "Here's the situation," Henderson said, accepting a coffee from Dr. Patel. "Humanity doesn't need council membership. We've proven that quite thoroughly over the past day. What we want is a partnership of equals." He gestured to General Zhao Wei, who activated a holographic display showing the new trade network humans had established. It was at least 3 times larger than our last intelligence reports had indicated. "Your species are so wonderfully creative," Chen added. "When not bound by unnecessary regulations, they come up with the most amazing innovations. Did you know the Arcturians and the Syrians have developed a joint entertainment streaming service? Apparently, reality shows are quite popular across species boundaries." The Arcturian and Syrian delegates tried to merge with their seats. "So here's our proposal," Henderson continued, sliding data pads across the chamber. "The council transitions from a hierarchical structure to a cooperative alliance. All species get equal voting rights. Trade regulations are simplified. Cultural exchange is encouraged rather than restricted. And yes, we included a clause about maintaining independent relationships because diversity in diplomatic approaches leads to innovation. Also," Chen added with a smile that made several species check their evacuation routes, "we brought donuts. In human culture, sharing food is a sign of good faith." But the council has operated under the same system for millennia," Vaxatur protested weakly. "Indeed," Henderson nodded sagely. "And how's that working out for everyone? Anyone want to share their real GDP figures? No. How about innovation rates, cultural development indices?" The chamber erupted in furious whispers as species representatives actually looked at the data. The proposed system wasn't just fair, it was significantly more efficient than our current model. "You planned this entire crisis just to prove a point about equality?" I found myself asking. "Ambassador Krell, thanks." Henderson turned to me with a genuine smile. "We planned this entire crisis to prove that cooperation works better than control. Also, we really enjoyed dramatic exits. They make excellent social media content." "Speaking of which," Chen added, "our cultural team has finished editing the footage from yesterday. We're calling it How to Negotiate with Ancient Bureaucracies, a Human Guide to Galactic Diplomacy. It's already trending on 6 different planets." As I watched the council scramble to accept the new proposal, I realized something profound about humans. They hadn't just outmaneuvered us diplomatically. They had turned the entire crisis into a teaching moment, complete with visual aids and refreshments. "By the way," Henderson whispered to me as the council voted to accept the new charter. "That martini offer is still open. We have a feeling you're going to need it when you see what we have planned for the cultural exchange program's next phase." I looked at his knowing smile and decided that sometimes the only reasonable response to human diplomacy is a strong drink and a good sense of humor. That was 3 standard months ago. The Galactic Council, or as it's now known, the Interstellar Cooperative Alliance, has changed more in that time than it did in the previous millennium. And somehow, against all logic and probability, it's actually working better. Trade volume has increased by 300%. Cultural exchange programs have exploded across species boundaries. Last week, I watched a Proximan soap opera featuring an Arcturian human love triangle. The ratings were astronomical. Vaxatur still serves on the governing board, though his tentacles occasionally tie themselves in knots when humans make unexpected suggestions. He's learned to keep emergency coffee supplies nearby. The humans call it diplomatic lubricant. Ambassador Blixmar's head crest never quite recovered its former glory, but he's become surprisingly adept at human negotiation techniques. Last month, he successfully bluffed his way through a trade deal using nothing but bad poker puns and strategically timed snack breaks. The Council archives now include a mandatory course for new diplomats titled Human Diplomatic Tactics, a Survival Guide. The first lesson is simply, if humans bring snacks to a negotiation, prepare for something dramatic. Dr. Nick Sara's research team has published a comprehensive analysis of human negotiation strategies. It's become required reading across diplomatic corps, though the section on human entertainment media comes with a warning label. Caution, binge-watching may occur, plan your schedule accordingly. As for me, I've learned to appreciate human diplomatic style. Yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it frequently defies logic. And yes, it somehow works better than anything we've tried in the past 1,000 years. I've also developed a taste for martinis, though I still can't figure out why they insist on putting small vegetables in them. The human delegation still attends council sessions regularly, though they've modified the chamber to include something called a snack bar and casual seating areas. Madison Chen claims it promotes more honest dialogue. She's probably right, though I suspect they also just enjoy watching various species try to figure out how to use human furniture. Last week, I overheard a junior diplomat ask Ambassador Henderson how humans became so skilled at galactic diplomacy. He smiled that knowing smile of his and said, "We spent thousands of years negotiating with ourselves." After that, interspecies diplomacy was refreshingly straightforward. To any future diplomats reading this report, I offer these words of wisdom. 1. If humans suggest taking a break from negotiations, they've already won. 2. If humans start sharing food, they're about to change the game entirely. 3. If humans record your diplomatic session, assume it will become a teaching material. 4. Never ever challenge them to a game of chicken. They invented it, they perfected it, and they will absolutely win it. The new galactic order is chaotic, unpredictable, and strangely efficient. Species that never talked before are now collaborating on projects. Trade routes that seemed impossible are now standard. And somewhere in human space, I'm sure they're already planning their next diplomatic revolution. Oh, and that automated message at the human embassy? They never did turn it off. They just added more music options. I'm told the current selection includes something called Baby Shark. Based on the reactions of human diplomatic staff, this may actually violate several weapons treaties. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson humanity has taught us. True diplomacy isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to share a donut, and when to play that song that never ends. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting at the human embassy. I hear they're planning something called a diplomatic karaoke night. Based on previous experience, this will either revolutionize interspecies cultural exchange or create several new intergalactic incidents. Knowing humans, probably both.